Welcome. Welcome to all of you who are curious and seek information and responsive action when Minnesota laws silence us. My name is Lucia Smith, and I welcome you on behalf of the Minnesota BDS community members who have planned this event and the several sponsoring organizations. I'm active too in Women Against Military Madness. And as part of WAM, I also wish to acknowledge that we are focusing our attention on laws passed in Minnesota, where historical reality echoes the recent agonizing violence in Palestine, in Jerusalem, in Gaza, and Israel. Today, 11 Dakota and Ojibwe reservation communities are located within the state of Minnesota. I invite you to consider the land on which you live and to engage in reflection and conversation within your own community about our mutual histories. Our intention this evening is to attend to current Minnesota laws and to complete presentations within the hour, and then the question answer session may continue a bit beyond 8:00 p.m. This webinar is being recorded. All the speakers will introduce themselves more fully than I do at this point. Our initial speakers include Joe Norcross and Ruben Slomiansky, both active in Jewish Voice for Peace, who will address the Human Rights Watch statement on apartheid, the specific Minnesota anti-BDS laws, and why BDS is not anti-Semitic. This evening's featured speaker is Mira Shah, Senior Staff Attorney with Palestine Legal. Her insights and slide presentation will inform us about anti-BDS laws passed throughout the United States and citizen efforts to challenge and repeal them. Miriam Al-Khatib of American Muslims for Palestine brings us the personal testimony of a Minnesota business person who is directly threatened by these Minnesota laws. Virgil Mathwitz of Middle East Peace Now will present specific actions each of us can take as we move forward. Finally, Sylvia Schwartz of Minnesota Break the Bonds and Maddie of the Middle East Peace Now board will direct your questions to the speakers. But first, Maddie, who is also tonight's technology whiz, will explain how to submit your questions this evening and how to access the recording of tonight's program for future use. Welcome and thank you. Now, Maddie.
Thanks, Lucia. Just a moment here while I switch. There we go. So just a few administrative notes before we begin our program this evening. All participants will be muted for the duration of the event. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we will put them in the queue. Use the chat feature for any administrative or help questions, and we will do our best to assist you. Please be respectful in the chat and Q&A, and we do reserve the right to remove anyone who is causing harm. If Zoom is not working for you, email mepn@mepn.org and we will try to help. And this event will be recorded and emailed to all registrants, and it will be available on Middle East Peace Now's YouTube channel within the next few days. So thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction information. Just to introduce myself again, I'm Joe Norcross, and I've been with Jewish Voice for Peace for 4 years. I was introduced to the group around the time that Minnesota's anti-BDS laws were introduced, which was an issue that really caught me by surprise. Bipartisan support for a law that clearly violated the First Amendment. Occurring around the time of the murder of Philando Castile and his murder's exoneration, I was having my own political awakening about how many other clearly awful and illegal things had bipartisan support, I was obviously learning about the relationship between some of Minnesota's various police departments and the IDF, and the intertwining of struggles here and abroad, such as in Palestine. I think that for many people in the US who are less engaged with the Palestinian cause, it can seem to them as entirely a foreign policy issue rather than a domestic one. So I think it's in particular the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, or BDS, which shows how that is not the case. Palestinian refugees living in the US and elsewhere in the diaspora are denied the right of return to their lands they and their families were uprooted from. BDS demands this right restored as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. The other two demands of BDS address Palestinians living under the apartheid state of Israel. First, that Israel end its occupation and continued colonization of Palestine. And second, that Israel restore fundamental rights of Palestinians that are restricted under Israel. These demands include dismantling the separation wall, which restricts movement in Palestine, and returning homes from which Palestinians were forced out of. Now, BDS can be more than just a way to push Israel to accept these demands. It's also a way in which to address how companies also operate in the US not only cooperate with Israel, but enable or incentivize Israel to further limit the freedom, justice, or equality of Palestinians. Even Human Rights Watch, by no means a leftist or radical organization, has described Israel as an apartheid state with actually several of its reasons involving ties to companies on the BDS list. Ruben later will note how these companies affect people living here in the US who might not want to support these companies. The Human Rights Watch report notes that Israel has ruled over more and more of historic Palestine, particularly following massive military takeovers in 1948 and 1967 that dramatically dispossessed Palestinians of their homes and restricted movement of Palestinians throughout their lands. Many discriminatory laws have been passed in the interim years by Israel that affirm rights of only Jewish Israelis and denying those of Palestinians it occupies. One of the more recent and egregious being a constitutional law describing Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people and the creation of Jewish settlements as a national value. These issues, the dispossession of Palestinians, the creation of military checkpoints to restrict movement, and the continued creation of settlements are all helped made possible by items on the BDS list. Israel may demolish Palestinian homes using Caterpillar bulldozers. Military checkpoints may use Hewlett-Packard biometric ID cards to identify Palestinians. Settlement properties may be rented out to non-Palestinian visitors through Airbnb and other home share websites. Many of these items on the BDS list, like Ben & Jerry's and Minnesota's own Pillsbury, are companies that also operate on settlements and therefore violate international law. Besides economic boycotts, there are also academic and cultural divestments and boycotts, which Israel and pro-Israel lobby organizations often fight strenuously given their early ground laying for the successful boycott movement in apartheid South Africa. The University of Minnesota student body itself has passed a resolution calling for the academic divestment of Israel. And yet, despite this resolution by UMN students, the Board of Regents has declined to take it up. In an attempt to stem the tide of cultural boycotts as public support for BDS grows, a full-page ad in the New York Times this past week falsely accused several celebrities, mostly Palestinian, of anti-Semitism for merely voicing support for Palestine. It's usually lower-profile people who feel the brunt of this campaign, though, such as a Texas teacher who lost her job for refusing to take an oath, vowing not to endorse BDS, or a junior level AP reporter this past week who lost her job after a conservative group's campaign to get her fired for her involvement in college with Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace. Finally, as Ruben will discuss, dozens of states have put forward anti-BDS laws to prevent people from engaging in boycotts of companies that are responsible, along with Israel, for obstructing Palestinians' journey towards freedom, justice, and equality. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining this session. I'm Ruben, a Jewish American whose family members include people who died as a result of the pogroms of the early 20th century and the Holocaust, and also now includes family members who suffer under the occupation in the West Bank. I've been active with Jewish Voice for Peace Twin Cities chapter for several years. Minnesota Senate File 1039 and House File 1246 have been introduced into the Minnesota Legislature to repeal two statutes adopted in 2017, Minnesota Statutes 3.226 and 16C.053, entitled Contracts with Vendors Who Discriminate Against Israel Prohibited. The 2017 statutes penalize businesses seeking contracts with the state of Minnesota for peaceful advocacy supporting the human rights of Palestinians. This initiative is about free speech and constitutionality. Boycott is constitutionally protected speech and is an American tradition going back to the Boston Tea Party and continuing into this century. The Montgomery Bus Boycott, 1955-56, the United Farm Workers Boycott, 1965-70, and the South Africa Apartheid Boycott are just a few examples of nonviolent initiatives that protested injustice and contributed to positive social change, both here and abroad. The Supreme Court has upheld the constitutionality of this type of speech in many cases. And yet today, 30 states have approved anti-boycott legislation, and 24 states, including Minnesota, have approved legislation that imposes boycott restrictions to be eligible for state contracts. This is a broad nationwide campaign to terminate civil debate and to penalize those with alternative views. Legislative initiatives in Arizona, Texas, and Kansas have been struck down by courts. Recently, the US 8th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that Arkansas's anti-BDS law violates the First Amendment, reaffirming that political boycotts are entitled to First Amendment protection as a peaceful expression to effect social, political, and economic change. This ruling is now under appeal. Today, a federal judge in Georgia refused to dismiss a case against the Georgia anti-BDS law, ruling that the lawsuit there has a right to move forward based on the unconstitutionality of the law. We believe that there will be more such rulings related to other states where this kind of legislation has been approved. No other statute in Minnesota singles out a specific country and penalizes people for peacefully voicing their opinions about that country's human rights policies and actions. The underlying issues that are being addressed in the 2017 Minnesota statutes belong in the realm of civil speech and debate, and not in a context where one viewpoint has a clear advantage and others are penalized for exercising their right to a different perspective. Keeping the law in place is unconstitutional and has the potential to get the state into unnecessary and costly lawsuits. Repealing the law is consistent with our constitutionally protected rights and sends a message that the Minnesota State Legislature is focusing on the real needs of Minnesotans. We need to act now to ensure that our legislators repeal Minnesota's anti-BDS legislation. Now I'd like to say a few words about anti-Semitism. Those of us who speak out against Israel's policies and behavior and their relentless attack on the human rights of Palestinians are often accused of being anti-Semitic. If we are Jewish, sometimes we are called self-hating Jews. Well, like the anti-BDS legislation, this is an abusive mechanism that is being used strategically to silence any criticism of Israel. It is important for us to be careful about the language that we use to carry on civil debate. As I mentioned, I've lost family members in the pogroms of the early 20th century and during the Holocaust. I'm extremely concerned about increasing anti-Semitic behavior. It's frightening and it's growing. However, branding people as being anti-Semitic for peacefully raising valid concerns about human rights abuses is both a deflection and an unfortunate waste of valuable resources. It deflects people's attention from very real and serious anti-Semitic behaviors, such as what we saw on the t-shirts and tattoos on white supremacists at the DC Capitol on January 6th. And it deflects attention from addressing policies and behavior that negatively affects millions of people. I invite my fellow Jews and others with similar concerns to join forces to combat the rising tide of real anti-Semitism and to focus our attention on finding reasonable and fair solutions that don't disadvantage huge populations of people. My Jewish background taught me to value human life, to have compassion for others, and to treat people with fairness and dignity. I firmly believe that my advocacy on behalf of the rights of Palestinians is rooted in those values, and that these shared values are the foundation of our work, regardless of our religious or humanitarian origins. It is not anti-Semitic to believe that one group shouldn't strive to achieve their safety, security, peace, and the well-being of their children at the expense of another group. It isn't right, and we have to speak out and work against it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And Mira Shah from Palestine Legal.
Thanks,
is going
Lucia.
to-
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks to the organizers. Thanks to the other co-panelists. Joe and Ruben, you've covered a lot of really important ground. What I'd like to do is kind of provide a little bit more sort of the broader context in terms of both the legislation that Ruben discussed that we're seeing, across the U.S., but also sort of how that fits into a broader pattern of repression that the Palestine movement has experienced. I'm going to share my screen to show some slides, and what I'm going to do is probably turn my camera off so I can focus on my notes and you can focus on the slides. 1 second. Sorry, 1 sec. Apologies. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to start with just some background on Palestine Legal. We are a legal advocacy organization whose mission is to bolster the grassroots movement for Palestinian rights. We provide legal advice, know your rights trainings, advocacy, and litigation support to college students, grassroots activists, and others who stand for justice in Palestine. We also document and track tactics that are being used to silence advocates for Palestinian rights, including repressive legislation. So I think Joe and Ruben have covered sort of this growing movement. It's student-led, it's diverse, it's dynamic. In particular at this moment, given the violence, the sort of forcible expulsions, the attacks on Gaza, the deaths of so many Palestinians in the past few weeks, the sort of protests that we've seen galvanized people speaking out against these violations. This has been growing for many years now. You see a range of different actors engaging in different forms of advocacy, including BDS, to stand against Israeli violations, from churches to campuses, academic boycotts, cultural boycotts. And the movement is also increasingly characterized by cross-movement support, interconnected with Indigenous, Black, and other racial justice struggles. And it's increasingly filtering up from the grassroots, something again that we saw in recent weeks with sort of a shift in narrative and the people who are willing to speak out, in support of Palestinian rights, criticizing Israeli policies. And, again, it's important to remember, I think Joe covered this, the growing movement for Palestinian rights here is a response to the ongoing and systematic violations of Palestinian human rights. And this decades-long impunity and lack of accountability really coalesced, over 15 years ago now, around a call from Palestinian civil society for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel until it complies with its international law obligations. It's modeled after anti-apartheid efforts to put international pressure on South Africa. And these calls for freedom, equality, justice for Palestinians, and criticism of Israel's treatment of Palestinians have been met with efforts to censor, chill, and sanction. My organization, Palestine Legal, has documented widespread censorship and harassment of Palestine activists over the years, more than 1,700 incidents since 2004. And those are just the incidents that we're aware of. Obviously, the problem is much more widespread than just the people who come to us. And we're seeing this right now in response to the widespread protests in support of Palestinian rights. You see, with this increased mobilization, we're seeing increased efforts to chill, punish, and silence activists. What are the tactics? There's a list here, and I won't necessarily go into details, but on campuses, you see school administrators, focusing greater scrutiny on student events related to Palestine, putting additional barriers or restrictions on those kinds of events. Schools going so far as to ban student groups organizing for Palestinian rights, such as at Fordham's SJP. You see faculty investigated for coursework or syllabus material related to Palestinian rights. There's hundreds of other incidents, and as others have mentioned, these false accusations of anti-Semitism or support for terrorism really lay the foundation for many of these tactics, smearing the movement and advocates with accusations. And increasingly, what we're seeing is that these most egregious tactics involving state repression are sort of on the rise, and legislation is a prime example. You see, so I'm going to focus a bit on sort of the trends that we're seeing in terms of the legislation, and anti-boycott bills are one, and I'll start with that. But just, more broadly, we have over 200 bills across the states that have been introduced that target advocacy for Palestinian rights. Majority of these have failed, but 31 states now have these kinds of laws in effect. Lawmakers in West Virginia and Idaho just this year have passed anti-boycott bills that will go into effect later this year or next. So anti-boycott bills, these, how do they work? I think Ruben mentioned, some examples of this. They are prohibitions on state contracts or, state investment in entities that boycott Israel. That is sort of the mechanism of many of these anti-boycott laws. These laws often require potential state contractors to provide a written certification or a loyalty oath that they are not or will not engage in boycotts against Israel. Some states require officials to compile and make publicly available blacklists of entities that support boycotts, prohibiting state contracts or investments with listed entities. These laws have had a material impact on the lives and livelihoods of those directly affected by them, in terms of denial of contracts, in terms of job opportunities. Folks have mentioned the speech pathologist in Texas, Vahia Amawi, filmmaker Abby Martin. But these laws have a chilling effect on speech far beyond their stated objectives, and confusion over the scope or deliberate misapplication of these laws has resulted in chilling, punishing, or attempting to punish speakers supporting Palestinian rights in a range of different contexts outside of that of state funding or state contracts. And let's be clear, that is the goal. These laws are designed to chill you into self-censorship. So, I think just to be, aware, there's, the formal sort of scope of the law and the text, but really there's a real effort to kind of, to broaden that, to apply it to different contexts, to really chill the movement, to chill speech in support of Palestinian rights. The good news is that courts have found these laws to be unconstitutional. As others have mentioned, earlier this year, the 8th Circuit reversed a lower court, finding that Arkansas's anti-boycott law violates the First Amendment. Just today, a federal district court in Georgia found enough constitutional concerns with Georgia's anti-boycott law to allow a challenge by filmmaker Abby Martin to go forward. And to date, not a single anti-boycott law has been upheld by the courts on its merits. So just to delve into that a bit, because I was asked to kind of provide some legal context here, the constitutional sort of concerns And I'll try to go over this quickly, but in case it's sort of helpful to understand some of why these laws are so problematic in terms of the First Amendment. I think others have mentioned, that the Supreme Court has upheld that boycotts are protected under the First Amendment, and that boycotts for Palestinian rights, really cannot be distinguished from these historical civil rights boycotts. There's a right to collectively make your voices heard, to get the government to pay attention. And the government cannot condition receipt of public benefits like state contracts on the requirement that you forego your constitutional rights. So I think the one other piece of the sort of constitutional concerns here is that these written certification requirements, these loyalty oaths that are required as part of state contracts under these laws, are a form of compelled speech that really run afoul of First Amendment rights. And I think finally one argument, just to sort of put it out there, first, the First Amendment protects the rights of individuals from government. Government does not have its own First Amendment right. There's no government right to boycott boycotters, as some politicians have claimed. And the government cannot punish people for exercising rights protected by the First Amendment, which is exactly what these laws are doing. And so I think, these are some of quotes from some of the recent decisions that we've seen sort of striking down these laws. And what has been interesting, right, is that, lawmakers don't take these decisions and kind of decide, oh, we're going to go ahead and repeal. That hasn't been the move. No, in most of these states where the courts have struck down these laws, rather than addressing the concerns, state legislatures have chosen to narrow the scope of these laws in order to carve out the plaintiffs. So, for example, by limiting application only to bigger companies, for example, or to contracts only over a certain threshold. But, that doesn't really change the underlying constitutional concerns with these laws, and the broader chilling effect remains unchanged. Touching briefly, I don't think I want to get into too much detail because I think Ruben covered this really in a lot of great detail. This is, Minnesota does have an anti-boycott law in effect. It prohibits the state legislature and state agencies from contracting with vendors that discriminate against Israel's or persons or entities doing business in Israel. And vendors are required to provide a written certification of their compliance. The law defines discrimination to include, quote, refusals to deal, terminating business activities, or other actions that are intended to limit commercial relations with Israel or persons doing business with Israel, when such actions are taken in a manner that in any way discriminates on the basis of nationality or national origin and is not based on a valid business reason, end quote. So, as written, and as we understand boycotts for Palestinian rights, this law should not reach boycotts for justice. Boycotts for justice are not targeting, a particular national origin or identity. They are targeting complicity in Israel's human rights violations. And so, having said that, though, the target of this law is clearly, those who boycott for Palestinian rights. And the original version of this bill prohibited contracts with vendors engaged in boycotts of Israel or territories occupied by Israel. And the enacted version just sort of replaced boycott with discrimination. And so, if you look back to the legislative history, if you look back to statements sort of in support of this bill, you can really see, what the target was in the course of that history. And I defer to all of you who've been on the ground and who've been fighting those fights to kind of fill in those details and who know that history way better than I do. If I have a few minutes, I want to just touch on another trend that we're seeing in the legislation really quickly, just because I think it's important to kind of look at these together. And these are what we're calling anti-Semitism redefinition bills. And I think it goes to what Ruben was saying is as part of these false accusations, how you're smeared when you speak out for Palestinian rights, that is actually translating into legislation now, where there is an effort to legislate a definition of anti-Semitism that is so vague and so overbroad that it would encompass nearly all criticism of Israel. And so this is sort of a trend we've been seeing increasingly in recent years. Florida and South Carolina have these laws on the books. It's failed to pass at the federal level so far, but in 2019, Donald Trump signed an executive order directing government agencies to consider this distorted definition when investigating allegations of discrimination under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And these redefinition efforts have really have come under several names and iterations. All of them sort of seek to just expand traditional definitions of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel. The most prevalent is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA definition. The IHRA definition includes illustrative examples of contemporary anti-Semitism that have come to be treated as part of the definition itself. And these include, quote, denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of Israel is a racist endeavor, or applying double standards by requiring of a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Some state bills, including the Florida law, go further, describing human rights investigations or reports that focus only on Israel as an example of such a double standard that could constitute anti-Semitism. So the IHRA definition's conflation of criticism of Israel as a nation state with anti-Semitism is problematic and dangerous for a number of reasons. First, there's the blurring of lines between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel that will result in censorship of constitutionally protected political speech. And this is why civil rights groups, including the ACLU, have opposed these bills over concerns that they will infringe on First Amendment protections. And then second, conflating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism really distracts. And I think, other speakers have pointed to this, from understanding and addressing the dangerous and deadly anti-Semitism, that we are seeing, on the rise in this country. And the author of, one of the sort of lead authors of the IHRA definition, Kenneth Stern, who's opposed these legislative efforts to codify IHRA into law, has noted that the IHRA definition really fails to address the bigotry and hatred that have driven some of the most dangerous manifestations of anti-Semitism that we've seen in recent years. And finally, just one thing to note in terms of why this definition is problematic and why we see it as aiming to chill and silence those willing to speak out for Palestinian rights, is because that is how it has been used. We have documented examples of how anti-Palestinian actors have been pushing to use this definition to shut down advocacy in support of Palestinian rights. I'll pull just one example. There was a vigil in November of 2018 organized by Jewish students at UC Berkeley to jointly mourn the deaths of Palestinian children killed in Gaza and Jewish people killed in the Pittsburgh massacre. And that became the subject of a Title VI complaint to the US Department of Education Office for Civil Rights. And attorneys who filed the complaint alleged the vigil was to portray, quote, Israel as a barbarian and racist nation, end quote, falling under the IHRA definition. And they said that the students who organized the vigil should be expelled. So that's just one example, and there are others of sort of how this definition has been used. I'm going to go through this just quickly because I know there's a lot of other speakers and I want to make sure there's room for questions. Alongside these false accusations of anti-Semitism, false accusations of supporting terrorism is another tactic that we've seen, quite a bit. And it's another tactic that's really used to silence sort of people who are willing to speak out for Palestinian rights. Something to keep an eye on, and it can be really effective because it scares people into self-censorship. That charge is so weighty that it's a really scary charge to sort of face, and we've seen it deployed to vilify and criminalize different social movements, with the state and sort of anti-progressive forces justifying repression by sort of constructing people demanding rights as violent threats to public safety. And you see this in recent efforts to smear Black Lives Matter and even the Associated Press with supposed links to Hamas. And it's an effort to kind of delegitimize criticism of Israeli policies and to deflect, I think, as well. Where is this coming from? So I think there's the Ministry of Strategic Affairs of Israel. Has devoted over $100 million to fighting boycotts and BDS. They've identified it as an existential threat. This is the same ministry that has bragged about shutting down bank accounts of human rights defenders, and they've taken credit for anti-boycott legislation as well. Pro-Israel groups in the US are also working closely with ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, bringing together conservative legislators and corporate lobbyists to develop and disseminate model legislation that safeguards corporate power and white supremacy. ALEC has been responsible for pushing stand your ground laws and voter ID laws, among others, and has been developing and advocating for bills targeting advocacy for Palestinian rights as well. I think that, Alex's involvement here and, I think that the fact that they're pushing these bills, it really signals the anti-progressive nature of anti-boycott and anti-Semitism redefinition bills. And it underscores the importance of cross-movement solidarity to address all of these repressive efforts together. And sort of, I think on that note, it's important to sort of, the repression that we're seeing, including the legislative repression, it's not unique to Palestinians or Palestinian rights advocacy. It's part of a broader context we're seeing here in the US, where the sort of, there's an effort to kind of crack down on dissent, to crack down on protest, crack down on human rights defenders. We've seen dozens of bills introduced just in the past year alone aimed at curtailing protest rights and punishing protesters. Even in the face, though, of these variety of repressive measures, we're seeing, the movement grow. We're seeing people sort of speaking out and willing to speak out more and more in support of Palestinian rights. We're seeing US representatives for the first time really take sort of pretty momentous steps in terms of the history of US lawmakers to call out Israeli apartheid here. And, I think we also are seeing affirmative legislation being proposed, and from the repeal bills to actual bills that hold Israel accountable for its violations, and to stop US funding for its violations. And that's ultimately what we'd like to see, is this kind of accountability for Israeli violations and the realization of freedom, justice, and equality for Palestinians and Israelis. And the idea is to create hopefully more space for these kinds of affirmative efforts to kind of grow and develop more. So I'm going to just stop and just say, Palegal, we're happy to be a resource where we can. We have a new-ish legislation site that I'll post in the comments here that has a lot of information about these bills and resources and analysis to help push back. We're trying to keep it up to date, and just, please let us know if there's anything that we're missing, or if there are new bills in your area that we're not aware of or that need to be updated. There's obviously all kinds of things that we miss, but I'm happy to answer questions, and I look forward to hearing from all of you who really have a lot more experience of sort of how this looks on the ground, and how the repeal can really take off here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mira. And now Miriam Al-Khatib is going to bring us a personal story of a business person who could be very dramatically, directly affected by the Minnesota laws. So Miriam, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me okay? Good. All right. Hello, everyone. And thank you to all the speakers before me. So before I read the statement, I do want to, again, put it into context, everything that has been said, that these laws have real life effects and chilling effects for people within our own communities. And the reason that I am reading the statement on behalf of someone else is because we couldn't put him and his business at risk, because this person does have contacts with the state and does support BDS and the boycott of Israel. And so, that is the reason I am having to read the statement on his behalf. So I'll jump into that. Hello, I am a Palestinian American, and I support the BDS call to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel until it ends its occupation of Palestinian land, gives full rights to Palestinian citizens, and allows for the right of return of refugees. The reason I'm taking this measure so passionately is due to the experience that I have had with the Israeli occupation since I was born. I can list many horrific experiences that I have encountered personally, but I'll include just one. In the late 80s, Israel decided to shut down schools in the whole country during the first Intifada uprising. I was caught by Israeli soldiers carrying school books, which was deemed illegal, and ended up with broken bones after they had beat me up. Fast forward to today, and my family that still lives in Palestine is under the constant threat and harassment of Israeli settlers. These settlers, which are protected by the Israeli state and army, are constantly attacking my family, inflicting damage to our land and our property. It's gotten so bad recently that they've had to have someone stay watch overnight to ensure that they can wake the family up in the case of a settler attack overnight. My family is from Hebron, and our experience facing settler violence is unfortunately not unique and experienced by many other Palestinian families dealing with the land theft and violence that comes with Israeli settlements, which are illegal under international law. Most recently, I watched in horror as Israel brought down its fourth military assault on the Gaza Strip, killing 66 children in a matter of 11 days. This came after the uproar over Israel's displacement of the families of Sheikh Jarrah, families that have been living in those homes for decades and now being thrown out by settlers, once again protected under the Israeli government and illegal under international law. Finally, Israeli soldiers desecrated the holiest site for Muslims in Jerusalem, Al-Aqsa, during our holiest nights of Ramadan. This too is a violation of international law. I am listing these examples of actual experiences I have been through and violence that my people go through. And yet I am asked as a businessman who has many contracts with the state of Minnesota to be silent and not speak up against these horrendous practices by the state of Israel. By supporting BDS, I am putting my business and my livelihood at risk. This has a chilling effect on people like me and other Palestinian Americans and allies that want to speak out about the atrocities of the state of Israel. As an American citizen who pays taxes and contributes to the $3.8 billion sent annually to the state of Israel and helps to maintain its occupation of the people of Palestine, it should be my right to speak out without fear of repercussions. As an American citizen, I expected this right to speak out and boycott to be protected under the First Amendment. As a Palestinian American, I want the country that I chose to make my home to allow me to stand up for justice and to speak out against Israeli crimes. I am in support of passing Senate File 1039 and House File 1246 to repeal the Minnesota statutes punishing Minnesotans like myself for standing up and speaking out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam, for reading that statement on behalf of a business person here in Minnesota. And I think that we can understand his very serious concerns. Thank you. Next, we're going to go to Virgil. Virgil Mathewitz has a call to action because we can, all of us in Minnesota, move forward to work to have these laws repealed. Virgil, are you there?
I'm here. I'm Virgil Mathewitz. I'm a board member of Middle East Peace Now, and I became active in supporting Palestinian rights after a 2017 trip to Israel and Palestine, where I had the opportunity to meet with many people who are working for peace and justice in that region. So tonight, the focus of this presentation and our asks of you is to support the repeal of the anti-BDS legislation that was passed in 2017. In the Senate, Senator Mary Konesh was the sponsor, the lead sponsor of Senate File 1039, and she has 4 co-sponsors at this point. And this exact same bill is in the House and was introduced by Senator Sandell, and that's House File 1246. And both of these bills were introduced relatively early in the legislative session, which was a success that we hadn't achieved before this. So that was progress. Unfortunately, given the nature of the focus of this session is the budget issues, these 2 laws did not get hearings in committees. And so we're hoping the laws have been introduced and they stay on the books through the next session. And so we don't have to introduce them again. But our goal is in the next session that we can get the bills moved on to committees and get a hearings in the committees and hopefully pass out of the committee and move forward. To do that, we need to convince many more senators and legislatures, representatives to support the repeal of these statutes, these anti-BDS laws. So our primary ask is that you contact your senator and representative with the ask of repealing, be a co-sponsor of the legislation. To find your legislators, your senator and representative, if you don't already know them, is there is a link in the chat, which is a link to the legislative locator, and you put in your address and it will tell you who your senator and representatives are. And I believe there are also links that you can click on to contact them. Also in the chat are 2 sample letters. The first one is to senators and representatives who have already signed on and are co-sponsors of the bills. We want to thank them for their support, and we want to provide them support because it is taking some risk for them to do that. And the second letter is a letter for senators and representatives who have not signed on to either of the bills. And so our goal is to convince them to become a co-sponsor, and or at minimum that they would vote in support of the legislation when the legislation comes forward. For those of you that are a little braver and want to take it a step further, I would encourage you to, when you contact your senator or representative, ask to have a meeting with them. Currently, that typically means a Zoom meeting. In the past and probably in the future, you could also set up visits to their offices. And we have found actually meeting in person and having a civil discussion is the most effective way of persuading a legislator to support this legislation. So our big ask is that you take the time to contact your senator and representative and ask them to sign on to support the bills. And if not, at minimum, that they would vote for the bill when it came up in committee or at the full House or Senate. And that's my ask, unless there's something else that others want to add to that.
Thank you, Virgil. It certainly might be in our question and answer time that people will be able to come if they're needing some additional clarification. So if you are finished up, and I think what we will do is turn the discussion over to Maddie and Sylvia, who are fielding the questions and comments from people, and will present those to any of the speakers who match up with those questions. Maddie and Sylvia, are you ready to go?
Yes, I am. Let's see. Yeah, the first question I have here is from John. Have there been any legal challenges to the Minnesota's anti-BDS laws, and has the ACLU taken a position? Now, I'm not sure that Mira would be very familiar with what's happening in Minnesota. And I wonder if there's anyone else on the panel who would like to answer that one. Ruben?
Yes, the ACLU was involved in 2017 when the original bills were being considered. And they were supportive of what we were trying to do. In the end, they were helping to recraft the language that helped to sort of lessen the impact of the bill, but they weren't completely against the final version. They kind of supported the final language. To my knowledge, there's not been any legal action against the Minnesota anti-BDS bill. And part of the reason, as has been pointed out already, is you need a complainant, somebody who's willing to come forward. And it's dangerous for some of these people to come forward. And so it's been difficult to actually come together with a lawsuit. So not yet.
I wonder if I can add just that we're working both on the legal side and also the legislative side. And right now we're asking people to contact their legislators because regardless of we believe these laws do not belong on the books. They're unconstitutional and they should be removed. They should be repealed. So that's why we're focusing right now on the legislative side. Now this one, Mira might be able to answer. Is there any historical precedent for a foreign country requesting that guarantees of free speech in this country be altered or restricted in such a way that the foreign country's self-image or political/judicial system be immune from criticism?
I don't know. I don't know the history of that, I guess, and I don't know sort of how, if others might have a better sense of, I think probably there's been efforts. I just don't know if they've been quite as successful, right? And that sort of speaks to there's lawmakers in this country have signed on to this as well, right? And there's been a great deal of bipartisan agreement that this is an acceptable limitation on our constitutional rights somehow. And so, I think that is the part that 31 states now have these laws on the books, and that's the part that feels very unprecedented.
Thank you, Mira. Would anyone else like to weigh in on that? Okay.
I guess I would also note it's not quite a legal example, but in the early 90s, the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, cooperated with police agencies to spy, harass, and intimidate political groups who engaged with the boycott movement of apartheid South Africa.
I'll just add, it's not specific to a foreign country, but I think it's important to note, and I see that there's this question about Texas as well, and I think it relates because there's a bill currently pending in Texas, I believe, where you see the same anti-boycott formulation, right? So that it's state contracts are prohibited to those who boycott not Israel this time, but oil and gas companies. So a really different sort of target there, right? But in terms of thinking about the forces there and the sort of again what I was talking about in terms of this crackdown on dissent, and where you see protests happening, you see sort of climate justice protesters, indigenous rights protesters, being sort of vilified and punished for speaking out against pipeline projects, right? And so now you have legislation being introduced in several different states that now make boycotting oil and gas companies, you sort of puts you outside of the scope of being able to hold a state contract. So, I think in terms of like precedent, I think it's also important to kind of see how across different social justice movements, these same forces are sort of at play. And again, a reason to kind of think about, and I'm thinking about the Texas context here, reasons to look for cross-movement solidarity, right? To push back against these efforts together, because clearly those pushing them forward are coming often from many of the same places. So yeah, that's a different sort of answer to that question, I guess.
That's a very good point. And then there are still the within Minnesota, there's somebody is wondering if there are any other anti-boycott laws like this in regards to countries, but I think that you answer that, as far as oil and gas pipelines, and also there are anti-protest laws and bills being promoted both in Minnesota and in other states too. If you have any comments on that, you can. I welcome them. Okay, let's move on. At this point in the legislative process, is there any chance of these bills being passed? Should we be focusing on next year's session? I can answer that one because it is specific to Minnesota. The legislative session is over for the year until January of 2022. And so, yes, we are focusing on next year. And if anyone else wants to add something. Not seeing anything.
Yeah, I think I could add a little bit. Yeah, I think probably the most effective time is early in the session, and so and we tried starting to push for getting the bills introduced this year. We started in November and December laying the groundwork for that, and so in next year or in the fall, late fall, is when it's particularly timely. But right now is also a good time to start convincing people, because it takes some time. So the more people that they hear from, the more likely they'll be persuaded.
Thank you. This is a question that this might take a while to answer. Since they have raised the bar on anti-BDS laws to be companies of certain size and a certain contract size, this appears to be more focused on companies rather than individuals. Do corporations have the right to free speech, or how does free speech of individuals affect corporate contracts?
I can try to answer some of that. I think the court decisions that we've seen so far really have underscored the idea that these laws are not about regulating commercial speech, and that this is the written certification requirements kind of really highlight how this is not about that. And I think the sort of, yeah, I think in terms of, yeah, I think that sort of, it's not about commercial speech so much, and the written certification requirements like that the courts have pointed to kind of show that this is about government sort of infringing on individuals' rights to speak out about a particular issue. The sort of raising the bar aspect of it just, I think, makes the laws harder to challenge, because it's a sort of who has been damaged or affected by these laws that becomes the issue, and there's just a sort of shrinking pool of companies or individuals who are affected by $100,000 contracts, for example, as a threshold that a lot of states have imposed. And that I think goes to the strategy of repeal, right? Because the legal challenges both are sort of so time consuming, resources intensive, and I think the laws have been narrowed in such a way that it makes it, they were intended to sort of carve out plaintiffs who were challenging these laws and to sort of make it not about individuals so much. And so, I think that really, to the extent that bolstering these efforts to repeal and really underscoring, why these laws are so problematic, I think that, that's sort of a strategy that really deserves sort of as much energy as one can put to it at this point.
Yes, thank you. This person is from Texas, and he wants to know, what do you recommend we do in Texas relative to our anti-BDS law, especially considering our legislature only meets every 2 years and they are approaching the end of their session now? And that might be either Mira or any of the panelists.
I'd be interested to hear from some of you who've been organizing at the state level, because I feel like your advice is probably much more on target. But I think in terms of what I was saying before, just in terms of building that cross-movement support and really building those alliances to kind of push back against these repressive measures across the board, with pending legislation targeting climate justice activists right now, as potentially an opportunity to kind of talk about these issues together and to sort of talk about the need to sort of stand up for constitutional rights, sort of regardless of what justice you're part of. And so that's in terms of I think that obviously building relationships with legislators and continuing to sort of lay that groundwork is critical. But yeah, that's sort of my thoughts. But I think that the folks at the state level might have some more targeted advice.
I'll just say briefly, I agree. Building coalitions is going to be critical. I think one of the ways that things work against us is the way these things tend to divide us. And the more that we are divided and isolated in our efforts, the easier it is to bypass the initiatives. But if we see the connection and we draw in relationships and partnerships, it tends to bring more weight. I know when we did the actions against the 27 legislation here in Minnesota, we weren't ultimately successful in stopping it, but we were successful in liquidating the language quite a bit. And we were able to bring a lot of visibility to the issue and create relationships with like-minded people and organizations in the process. And I think that, that's especially if you have a period of time between now and when you have an opportunity to do anything directly in Texas, it's a great time to make those relationships and start building the support. And like Mira said, start having relationships, building meetings with the different legislators in the process.
Yeah, I would also add that it takes a lot of patience. We've been working on this for a number of years, and only now are seeing some, a little bit of movement in the legislature. So it takes a long time and a lot of patience. This person asks Mira whether the Palestinian businessman in Mariam's example would have legal standing to sue the state of Minnesota because of his self-censorship in order to not jeopardize his state contracts.
I would encourage him to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to have a conversation or refer him to folks who could help out, because I think it really just depends on the specifics of his particular circumstances, and I need to know more details. I don't know that I could answer that question without knowing more. But I just in general, I think for those who are feeling chilled, who are feeling like these laws are preventing you from advocating for Palestinian rights and speaking out, I the first thing I would say is that these laws don't really affect your right to boycott, as we're seeing with these court decisions one after another. At the same time, the sort of chill is real and the fear of consequences is real. And so if anyone is experiencing that, definitely feel free to reach out to Palestine Legal. And we provide legal advocacy support. And so if we're not able to sort of answer questions, or if we don't know the answers, we can definitely refer you to other attorneys in our network who might be able to support as well.
Thank you. How do our two major parties in Minnesota stand on BDS? Again, I'm not sure that Mira can answer this, but maybe somebody else, Ruben or Virgil or Joe.
I'll just say what we're hearing is that we have a better chance with this repeal process in the Minnesota House than in the Senate at this point. There's some feeling among those of us who are involved that we might actually be able to succeed in the House. It's going to be a tough go in the Senate. But that's partly why we're doing this now, as Virgil said in a previous answer. We feel that we need to use this time while they're not in session to have as many people as possible contact the legislators so that they're hearing from more people and more of them are hearing from more people. What we found in 2017 is that very few people carry a tremendous amount of influence with the rest of the people in their legislative body, because they have a lot of stuff that they're dealing with, and they're looking to a few key people to get advice on, well, what do we do? Well, you're Jewish and you know about Israel. You were there last year on a trip. What should we do about this? And then a whole pile of people follow whatever that person says. And so if that person is saying, well, this is anti-Semitic and it's a terrible thing and this is awful, a lot of them are going to just go along with that. Then they don't even have to read anything or learn on their own. But if somebody in that room also says, well, I don't know, I've got 50 people who contacted me and told me that this is really not fair and it's not right and we shouldn't be doing this, then at least there's another voice in the room. And so, we're hoping that by doing this now, and we're going to continue to keep this going, that by the time we get to fall, maybe we'll have a lot more people who are going to be in the room who have heard from more people, and that could have an impact. And as Mira said, there's some remarkable changes in the way some of our national leaders are starting to speak about the issue. And boy, this is a moment. So I think we need to grab the moment and take advantage of the fact that there's more diversity of opinion being allowed in the cultural narrative. And we need to raise those voices as much as possible.
Thank you.
Yeah, I certainly agree with everything that Ruben has said. I think one of the things that I've found is that you have to do a lot of educating, because a lot of people have very little knowledge. So if you talk about the BDS movement, many of the legislatures wouldn't know what you're talking about. And so you kind of have to start at a basic level as you're making your arguments, and make sure they understand the basics. And the other thing is, really helps if you have personal stories that relate to the issue. That's also tends to be very persuasive. So
Thank you. I have a question that I'm going to pose to Lucia. This has to do with Pillsbury. It's a Minnesota company, and there's currently a boycott action against Pillsbury products. So the question is it Pillsbury grandson who agrees with the boycott Pillsbury products? Can there be an action related to that?
Yes, Charlie Pillsbury, one of the friends of the Minnesota BDS, was American Friends Service Committee, got in touch with Charlie Pillsbury, who is a grandson of, he in the larger Pillsbury family, and he wrote the opinion piece that was published in the Star Tribune about why some members of his family support the boycott of Pillsbury products. Excuse me. Pillsbury is owned by General Mills, and we did hold a I'm going to show you a photo. We had an action outside of the General Mills headquarters last September that was kind of coordinated with the shareholders, the annual shareholders meeting, which was of course done on via Zoom or some, remotely. So we did have about 40 people there with signs, and we made some good speeches, and then we also presented some questions to the board of directors of Pillsbury, which they managed to kind of skirt, but it was good. It was a good action, and I'm thinking we might do something similar at General Mills in September again. I have another picture. Here it is. This one, if you're familiar with General Mills, this is the big G at General Mills that shows a big statue of the General Mills logo, and we gathered there, and we did have a little bit of coverage in the Star Tribune business section also about this. So we do call for a boycott of Pillsbury products. Thank you for the question, and watch for another protest probably in September.
Thank you. Now I see that it's 8:13 already, and I can go on. We have many more questions. I can, let's see. Here's a question. If one is a company that wants to boycott, do you recommend one sign them and file a suit immediately, or not sign and sue or something else? Thanks for clarifying the process. This is the difficulty with Minnesota's law. There is no certification requirement for getting a contract. You just have to know that there is this prohibition on boycotting. Mira, do you want to take that?
I think if there's like a specific situation that someone is thinking about or dealing with, then probably contacting Paralegal directly to talk about the details of that would be best. I think it is one of the things that makes challenging these laws really difficult in terms of how to show that one is harmed here. And at the same time, we know that people are chilled and people are harmed. And so, to the extent that if you have questions or you have concerns, to reach out and to get advice on that.
Thank you. And we have contact with you pretty regularly. And so if there is somebody in that situation, they can contact us too, and we can get all together on that.
Yeah, and I will. I'll drop paralegals. We have an intake form, for legal questions. I'll drop that in the chat as well.
Okay.
Sylvia, I have a question about when we send out information to the participants, people who registered for this webinar this evening, could we communicate with the registrars, with the people who registered, to let them know about the recording of the session, and also perhaps the information about how to contact legislators and the sample letters, the suggested samples? Would that be feasible?
Yes, I think that's a good idea. Okay. Opponents have said that this boycott legislation is in response to Arab boycott efforts from years ago. Can you help us know how to respond to such an argument?
I'm happy to start. I'm interested to hear what others say on this as well, but they are distinguishable. They're distinguishable under U.S. law. The sort of Arab League boycott from earlier decades is sort of a state imposed, state required economic boycott, and it is distinct from sort of consumer boycotts in support of justice and boycotts of entities complicit in human rights violations. There are definitely some good articles distinguishing these two, and that is in terms of if that's an argument that it's sort of you're confronted with. There's some really good analysis and arguments for pushing back against that point. So I will look for those. If I'm not able to put them in the chat, I'll send them to the organizers so they can be included, hopefully, in some of the resources that get sent out after.
Thank you, Mira. That makes me think of another situation. Soon after our previous governor, Dayton, signed these anti-boycott laws into effect, North Carolina passed its bathroom law requiring trans kids not to use the bathroom or something. And Governor Dayton then imposed a boycott on North Carolina. So would that be the same thing as a state-sponsored boycott of similar to the Arab boycott?
I think it's a little different. In the sense, state in the sense of like a foreign government, a foreign state is calling for a boycott. That's the issue in the context of the Arab League boycott. And I don't know the answer, to be honest, in terms of whether the analysis or argument would apply in exactly the same way with sort of internally states boycotting one another here in the U.S. I feel like there are different issues involved there, but it's not something I've looked at very closely. So apologies.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I see. Let's see. There's somebody from Kansas here also who asks, in land of Mennonite math teacher Esther Kuntz victory against anti-BDS law. Meanwhile, I have a First Amendment appeal in the Eighth Circuit over arrest at a public event at the Kansas City Public Library by an Israeli training junket trip taking and Israeli paid off-duty Kansas City police detective who worked at DHS Fusion Center. Is there any legal movement on the First Amendment issues of Israeli partisan contracting and Israeli training of police and Homeland Security public officers? This is getting a bit out of off subject, so I don't know if you want to answer that or not.
I am not aware of legal avenues, but I would suggest that there's quite a lot of organizing done around this topic and to check out the resources at Deadly Exchange.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would suggest also Deadly Exchange for that source.
I think there's
Other
quite a
questions?
lot of information about Deadly Exchange on the Jewish Voice for Peace National website.
Yeah. There was a question in the chat about other Minnesota companies that are companies based in Minnesota that we might boycott. I'm not aware of any personally. In the past, we have boycotted other Israeli companies or companies that were operating out in settlement areas. And one was like SodaStream, for example. But there's something in the chat about Grumman. There is going to be a demonstration at Northrop Grumman, but that is because they are selling, selling weapons to Israel. Yeah. I think that's coming up, I don't know, Saturday in Plymouth and there.
Okay.
I'll also note that Pillsbury is owned by General Mills, so they're subject to the boycott. But there's a great app called Boycott, which you can actually scan items barcode and find out if it's on the BDS list. So I found that to be a very useful thing for identifying which products are on the BDS list and even other boycott movements.
Well, that's
So is
interesting.
that BUYCOTT.com?
Yeah, Boycott, BUYCOTT, and it's an app.
Yeah, I just have it here in the chat. Thank you. And yes, to Manju Sabra. I'll also list the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions website, and you can see all the companies that are listed in there as well.
Good, thank you.
I think this might be the last question that I have here, and that is, what evidence is there that that anti-BDS law backers bring economic threat to bear on state legislators who might be inclined to back efforts to get rid of Minnesota anti-BDS legislation? So I think there's a couple of double negatives there. So I'm not, I can't, let's see. That's, is it possible to unmute Jonathan's microphone and let him ask it himself?
Yes. There you go, Jonathan Hill, if you are able to ask your question, that would be great, just so we can clarify.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, thank you, Sylvia. Yes, sorry, that was a very contorted question. Let me simplify it. I know that at the national level, national legislators who do not follow AIPAC instructions can be threatened economically when it comes to the next round of elections. In other words, money backing would be withdrawn and transferred to their opponents. Does the same thing happen at the Minnesota state legislative level? That is to say, those who are defending the Israeli position, do they threaten Minnesota legislators who are questioning the uncritical acceptance of Israel's policies, and who might be inclined, therefore, to dilute or even get rid of the anti-BDS laws that are currently are currently here in Minnesota? Are they threatened with this kind of economic threat? I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself, but is my question clear?
Yes. Yeah, Jonathan, I think the question is clear. And my sense of it, and someone else might have something to add, is my sense of it is that it's very difficult to determine. I have not heard from a legislator that he or she is being threatened with defunding or funding of an opposition candidate. I do think, though, that many legislators have a fear of being labeled anti-Semitic, and that's why I think it's a good thing to bring that concept straight out right when we talk with them. Anyone else?
I would just like to add, yeah, I think that while we may not know about specific economic targets or methodologies, I think we can't discount the power of shaming. Whether it's specific to money, I don't know, but I think that the shaming issue, like Lucia mentioned, the branding people, the isolation of people, I think is really, really powerful.
Well, thank you all. I think we have some information in the chats. I hope everyone has copied that down. I really appreciate the many people who came to participate in this forum with us. It's important to know what avenues we might have when Minnesota laws silence us. And I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you to the panelists, the speakers who were present this evening. Thank you very much. And now we all have work to do, so carry on bravely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucia. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.